Good evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 11, Episode 6, where we are delighted to be welcomed by a friend of the Rookery. She's been on a number of times before and we're always excited to greet her again, Jendia Gammon. Welcome to the stream, Jendia.
Hi, great to be back.
We're happy to have you. So today we're going to be talking about building Eldritch realms. I've got lots of questions pre-submitted on our Discord server and from patrons, so we'll get right through them. But please do also remember, if you have any questions or comments, pop them in the chat and I will bring them up on screen for us to chat about. We've got raiders coming in, so Lawhammer is coming in and raiding us. We are talking with Jendia Gammon today about building Eldritch realms. Welcome to the stream, raiders and non-raiders alike.
Welcome.
Excellent. We need to talk about the mug.
Yeah, I stole it actually. It was a gift to someone and I was like, you know what? You're not using it. I'm taking it.
Yeah, you don't appreciate that like I will.
See, exactly.
I like the coral and turquoise colorway. That in and of itself is slightly horrible.
Yep.
Scary.
Yep.
Yeah. Lawhammer loves the bug. Good. So where are we going to start? I'll pop one in from the pre-submitted ones while people gather in the comments. So Martin asks, when you set out to build an Eldritch realm, where do you begin? It's a very broad question.
Right. So, Eldritch horror, sort of Lovecraftian horror is that philosophy of having this ancient, uncaring otherness, and essentially a kind of godhood, from outside of our experience, outside of our world dimension, etc. And so you think about building an Eldritch realm, the first thing that comes to my mind is the outsider effect of something, coming in that's so immense and unfathomable. And so when you address it in writing, you kind of have to decide how intimate do you want a relationship with that other space, that other void, those other beings to be. And I've approached it a little bit differently in different books and short stories, especially. So, for example, I think one of my most fun short stories is actually a cozy cosmic horror story in my short story collection, To Wonder and Starshine. And in that, there is an eldritch being that somehow ends up in Appalachia, and it's called Watercolors at the Edge. And there's a gal who's just doing her art on the mountain, and this thing drops from eternity, from the dark stars, right? So that becomes an intimate conversation from the outside. But I like to approach it also from how it's affecting a person's psyche and what's going on with them. And then those cases, I don't like to reveal too much of where the place is and where it's coming from, that kind of thing. And so in my upcoming novella, Godfestation, it's an invasion of our world split open through intense emotion. And it's trickling in from various angles, and it's competing with old and new gods created in real time. So to me, it's a different approach each time, depending on the narrative of the story. And with my upcoming fantasy debut, The Veil of Seven Dragons, that's an epic fantasy that has a cosmic horror villain. And that is an invasion into this fantasy world, the realm, the Veil, by cosmic horror monsters that begin to infiltrate. It splits into their world, and so I don't reveal where that is coming from at this point in the trilogy. And I know that Lovecraft at the Mountains of Madness, he tends to dig in a bit and Call of Cthulhu, right, with sort of the place that they've come from in a way, but I kind of like to keep it a little spooky and not get too detailed about origins. And forgive me for saying that I don't want to get into the George Lucas effect of over-explaining, right? Because to me, some of the mysteries makes it more terrifying. That being said, one of the things I would like to do would be to actually write a book that is very much taking on the realm, the Eldritch realm itself. And I'm kind of cooking on that. And that would be sort of Event Horizon kind of situation, which is space horror combined with cosmic horror, because the two are kind of different. But in that, there is definitely a peak, a brief flash of this other realm. And I consider it an Eldritch realm, or hell, or whatever you want to call it. But to me, it's Eldritch. That's how I interpreted Event Horizon anyway.
Yeah, I think so. So I'm going to bring this one up early. So I made a TikTok today because when I was reading that we were talking about Eldritch realms, I was like, something tickled at my mind, and I was like, where does the word is quite an unusual word. It's an unusual spelling. It's like not like many other words in the English language. And I was like, I think it might be Scottish. Like something just tickled in my mind. So I went and looked it up, and sure enough, it was. And in Scots, it would be, the discussion we're having today would be a tautology, because Eldritch realms, the root of Eldritch is elf realm or otherworldly realms. So today we're talking about otherworldly realms.
Right.
So it was quite common in Scotland in various poetry in like the 16th century to talk about like gasties and brownies and boogles as Eldritch without the T, so we would pronounce it like Eldritch.
Yeah.
And then H.P. Lovecraft must have like adopted it from somewhere, and then that's where now we really think about Eldritch as so tied to the Cthulhu mythos, but actually in Scotland, Eldritch would be things like the Scottish folk horrors of the washerwoman, the Banni at the ford, who's doing her washing, and if you cross the ford and she slaps your leg, you're doomed to die. The Great Grey Man, which no one ever really sees, you just feel him on the mountains. And so a lot of Scottish horror is that every day, but with a twist, like the fear you feel when you're alone and something normal's there, but you're not sure it's normal anymore. So how do you do that? Do you play on every day? And if you do, how do you turn that Eldritch?
Well, in Godfestation, the everyday, becomes completely skewed after the death of the main character, Fern. Ivy Fernberg, she goes by Fern. After her father dies, everything is destroyed for her, in a lot of ways. But she first comes across something in the mountains of Appalachia, on the mountaintop. There's always this mountaintop, and I'll get back to that in a minute about mountaintops. And so to her, suddenly, like a trip to a diner to escape whatever she sees, suddenly it's everywhere. Suddenly, like the person sitting at the diner is not a person anymore. It's some sort of topa or weird situation happening, an invader, and very threatening, and then, but in other cases, not as threatening, more fey-like, like in the lands where her father is from, she encounters this being that protects her in a sort of a bubble of where that place is from another being who's ready to, split her soul open, and so it's like, but it appears as an everyday thing, like a flower, a root, and then it starts to grow and become something else. Or a knife in another case, that becomes something quite terrifying. So it's all these just everyday little things, interactions that are thrown into a very uncanny and strange place that feels really unsettling, and not right. And she knows it, but she thinks that it's just her, that she's hallucinating this because of her grief, but other people are beginning to experience things too. So it's not just her. So it's, an everyday stuff like, well, the watercolors at the edge situation where, you're just sitting there doing your art, and then something drops, you think it's water or mist from the sky, and then it becomes this immense creature that, expands, trillions of miles into space, So it's just, to me, that's like the everyday interaction things that I talk about a lot in my books. Now, in epic fantasy, it's a little bit different because it's a true invasion and there's actual monsters of transforming people into more monsters, so that's a little different. But for everyday stuff, like things get uncanny and you feel like there's a presence, and it can either be or not. And in the case of Eldritch, it's definitely not your friend.
I feel like there's scope for an Eldritch horror story about the mountains of Appalachia and the mountains of Scotland. We've talked about that before, that they were once connected and now they're torn apart by deep time and geology. But it echoes, and that's why I think there's something in it for a folk horror story about that many of the settlers in Appalachia were Scottish and Irish, and so they've ended up being drawn back to mountains that were split apart by deep time.
Right.
And I find that
Deep
myself
time.
like really profound and like shiver inducing, and there's like got to be something there.
Oh, well, there's Old Gods of Appalachia is a famous podcast that talks about that very thing. So I'll give them a shout. And that's just a regular podcast where they talk about that. It's a lot of people who write Appalachian horror these days do tend to nod to the uncanniness of the region and the various spiritual and elder presences that we may feel, even if it's just like haints or stuff up in the holler, so I talk a little bit about that. There's a short story I wrote years ago called Night on Preston's Bald. And it's kind of based on a true story where I was up Southern Appalachia. I was hiking on Roan Mountain and nightfall came and there was somebody there. And like, we didn't see the person. We couldn't see them. They were in shadow. Turns out they had a whole truck there. The only thing that we saw about them was like a little meteor flying from them. And it was like a cigarette. And then they were, then this music comes on. We're like, Jesus Christ, what's going on? And we ran. And then there was just something really threatening there. And like all the stars, like there were shooting stars that night. I believe it was the Perseids. And we could feel the presence of everything pushing down on us. So in Night on Preston's Bald, I wrote about that and how I twisted it around so that there absolutely was something on that mountain. And it was like, you shouldn't be here, and then the main character is marked by them and she's allowed to survive, but her partner isn't, and so like there's a point where you see all these spinning bodies, swirling around and she has to run. So, whenever I would go hiking in Appalachia, I live in LA now, but my heart is still there. I'm kind of split between the two. I would often feel an uncanny situation, but I sort of I'm not super spiritual, but I had this respect for nature, and tied in with my ecology degree, of course. But I always kind of felt like you walk into the spaces of Appalachia with respect. If you hear something or something tells you to leave, you don't wait, you get out of there, so it's like, it's just something we can't quite describe, in deep time, like the mountains are older than the rings of Saturn, many, it's so old. It's no wonder that these stories kind of come out of there because that's well before mammals, and well before the dinosaurs, going way back. There's lots of fossils in the area and you just feel something old, something older than old that is not fathomable, and it affects you as a storyteller, as an artist,
It's interesting. There's a really strong connection there with like romantic poetry. And the whole concept of the sublime, which I've never really formed that connection in my brain before, but that
in
makes
a lot
me
of ways,
want to,
I feel like Edgar Allan Poe, who influenced Lovecraft, kind of tapped into that with some of his work, and so
Samuel Taylor Coleridge literally uses the word Eldritch. So where he got it from, I'm not sure, because it wasn't really in English. Like, it was a Scots word. So he uses it in Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And I feel like Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
a very different poem. Yeah.
A very different poem, but we should do that. We should rewrite it. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is at its heart really quite inexplicable and eldritch in how it goes out.
Oh, and can I give a shout out to fellow Scot, Rob Turpin, the artist, wonderful artist. This Northern Boar, I think, is his handle, and he does a lot of stories like Innismouth kind of stuff related to cosmic horror. Just brilliant. I love his work, and I love that he's kind of dug into that Lovecraftian side of things. He also does a lot of stuff. So, but
and I'm sure it's probably an instinctive reaction related to, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and us being the ones to, to survive. But my brother and I had felt that fear and like proper fight or flight response in the foothills of Schiehallion in the Highlands of Scotland. And it was like that. We just looked at each other and we knew we had to run. And we were terrified, but there was no reason for it. And we sort of got to the bottom of the hill and we looked at each other and we felt like we never really understood it. And then we just, you know, so this is near a cottage where, you know, there's a round tree at the front door, there's a round tree at the back door, there's mirrors on both sides of the front door to ward away witches. It's built right next to running water. Like everything in that cottage says that you're in a place where you need to be cautious and guard yourself against something. And that's probably why I got scared, because the older kids that I went with would tell me all these stories, but it genuinely came from nowhere.
Right,
like a sunny day, and then just suddenly like a chill and a fear, and we ran. Yeah. So,
and I mean, the reason that it's like struck with me is just I'm just thinking of how many poems I teach students, and out of all the poems that exist, I only teach a tiny sliver of them.
Right,
how many of them are about going into nature, being overwhelmed by something you can't understand, and either finding that incredibly comforting or finding that terrifying and you need to run away from it.
Yeah, but, I mean, I think
like Norman McCaig does it. Obviously Wordsworth does it. There's a lot.
It is a way, you know, poetry is a lens through which you can cope with a lot of powerful feelings that you might not understand otherwise, you know, and it's a lyrical way of dealing with that. So it makes sense to me, and it would be a really fun topic to talk about poetry and, you know, Eldritch presences and other mystical presences. And
I smell a future stream coming on.
Because McCaig was from Edinburgh, right? But I've just looked him up, and his mum was from his mum was from Scalpay in the Outer Hebrides, and like I would imagine that he was infused with the tales from the Isles of that kind of like.
How could you not be? Right.
Yeah.
It's famously his Aunt Julia who spoke Gaelic very loud and very fast, which is the opening.
So I'll get onto the questions in the chat because we have a few. I think they're love questions in the background stuff. Yeah,
I'll share some McCaig links in the chat because I love him.
Yeah, thanks. So, in the Mountains of Madness, it is because he wants the horror to be the time depth and the meaningless of human history of that versus, e.g., Color Out of Space, where the cosmic horror is way more mysterious. That's not a question, that was just a comment I wanted to bring up. So, but Mr. Mike has got a question, and Jendia may not. Again, I always warn our guests that we may get Horus Heresy questions. So, most benevolent and sublime Ms. Jendia and Rookery crew, what type of eldritch horror could the Horus Heresy embody the most? A fantasy-esque one, I see what you're saying there, or perhaps something else? I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. Usually I've got I think you would probably use the chaos as because that's when chaos is not well known in the galaxy and is beginning to emerge. So that's what I think you'd use as the eldritch horror in the Horus Heresy. The ancient gods that are rising, that are not known, and the fight that the Emperor has, who represents like the here and the now and the real and the known against this unknown.
Yeah, and like the Event Horizon that Jendia mentioned, like is essentially a prequel to 40K.
The unofficial.
The you know, the way they travel through hell, the way they travel through warp in 40K, it's a very similar concept. So yeah, the unknowing, and it was like back in the first edition of like Rogue Trader, where you had, you know, there was a lot more focus on the unknown of it. It was a lot less regimented because there were far fewer miniatures made, so it was much more kind of creative. So there was a lot more of the stuff in there, and obviously because it was Games Workshop, it was all magpied from 8 million other IPs, like, you know, Navigator guilds and all that kind of stuff. But there was something there with like the Navigator's eyes used to be it was much more. They had this third eye that let them kind of see, but there was something much more eldritch and uncanny about that you were sort of seeing beyond into something you shouldn't see, and that's why it was so deadly.
And I'll just bring this one up. Thank you so much for the super chat. But the Quartet for the Dusk of Man poem seems apropos. Who's that by, Andy? Look that up.
I am bringing it up.
Great, thank you. We will just a comment from Says. I don't know if that's how we pronounce it. My favorite eldritch god is Hermias Mora from Elder Scrolls. Very typical Lovecraft, but really fun. Also love his demons being people who lost themselves in his endless library searching knowledge.
That would happen to me.
Oh yeah, 100% that would happen to me.
How you trap me as an Eldritch god, it's like put me in an endless library. And I write about space libraries a lot, incidentally, throughout my short stories. There's a whole lot of references to space libraries. So I kind of feel like it's heading somewhere not so happy.
Yeah. Mountains are sometimes thought of in Ireland as having little people. That's the same in Scotland. So in Scotland, there's lots of stories about people going away under the mountains. There's a fairy door. You know, the person goes away and comes back ages later, or they go away for a night and they come back old. Lots of stuff like that.
And you have changelings and all that going on.
Yeah. Okay, so Ben asks, what language feature and vocabulary can we apply to our description of a place to effectively give it the sense of being Eldritch?
Language feature and vocabulary to a description of place. Well, you know, Lovecraft himself used dark stars and creeping and dripping and those references to sort of oozing, slimy, all these things that kind of seem primordial to us, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say that just when you were saying those words, Jendia, dark stars, creeping, dripping, oozing, in English, they're not from Latin roots, they're not from Greek roots, they're not the language of science, they're the language of a more basic understanding of the world, like a more primordial part of our language.
Yeah,
like
and just this, the creeping dread. There's just like this, it's steeped in dread, right? Like they can't quite put their thoughts totally toward it without losing their minds, so there's an avoidance and a tentative thing. And of course there's like tentacular and like everything kind of leaning toward primordial style beings from our own experience that we do know about, including in our oceans, or in our fossil records and that kind of thing, but twisting them around so that, because I feel like we as flesh and blood mammals, we don't really have those features, right? They're very other to us for the most part, or when we have them, it's viewed as not pleasant, like if we're oozing blood or pus or anything like that. So it's all but when you have like fungi or mold or things like that, it's just this sort of creeping slime and all these things that seem, sort of, there's a tactile unpleasantness to those terms, right? It makes you think of texture, things that you touch and stuff like that. And I feel like some horror movies really did that well, particularly the Alien franchise, right? Yeah. And The Thing, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I think as well, like, again, to hark back to poetry, because I've been teaching a lot of it recently. But one of the things that a lot of poets seem to deal with, not just with this, but often with that, like I'm thinking of like Snow by Louis MacNeice and so on, but the sort of intentionally writing things in a way that's like ungrammatical, so dropping articles and things like that, so that it is familiar, but it is also like what they mean, but you also don't know what they mean, and then perhaps combining like almost like synesthesia in writing, like combining the wrong senses together. Again, just creates that sense of displacement. You're like, well, I know what that word means, and I know what that word means, but putting the two words together, I don't know what that means, and that leaves your brain in that just slight position of panic and confusion and struggling to understand but failing to understand. So
it's disorientation, right?
Yeah, that's the word. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was actually going to suggest that too, Andy, but I was going to suggest that there's a really fine line where if you do that badly or too much, you ruin the immersion because it just gets annoying.
Yeah, it gets really repetitive and annoying. So,
and like you're just making spelling mistakes. That's just annoying.
Yeah, I think moderation is key, and it's sort of, you don't want to lift the veil too much. You don't want to over-explain because, things that are uncanny are things that are unexplained. And in an ever-increasing knowledge-based world, the less that we can explain. It feels, it's a trick, right? It feels like we're getting so much explained. We still don't know anything.
Wasn't Burns was before Coleridge, and Burns did use it in Tam O'Shanter, I think. I think in his epic poem Tam O'Shanter he uses Eldritch. I can't remember which part, but I'm sure he does. And was it some type of bothy, Lindsay? Yeah. So this place was just called The Cottage. It was in a place called Foss, which, by the way, is an Old Norse word itself for waterfalls, and it was down from some waterfalls. Yeah, but it was your classic 2-room Highland bothy. So like living room, bedroom, you probably would have brought the cows in. But the family that owned it and we used to go there on holiday with, he was an architect. And so he'd redone it. So there was now an upstairs with extra bedrooms and a kitchen on it. So yeah, it was absolutely an old crofting, like farming house.
Very cool.
It was, yeah, the most...
I love stuff like that.
The most Eldritch thing about it, I think, though, was that the fact that one whole wall was wallpapered with an ordnance survey map, or actually multiple ordnance survey maps of the area.
Oh, wow.
That's not Eldritch. What was Eldritch was, at the time that they were redoing that cottage, it was in the sort of, I think, 60s, 70s, when they were building a lot of hydroelectric power stations and dams in Scotland. And so the loch nearby, Loch Tummel, had been, when the dam was built, the loch had got bigger, as they often do. And I always, like, it was the creepiest thing, because he was an architect. The map was old, so the map was from before the dam was built, and he had gone round and drawn the new outline of the loch on the map. And I was just obsessed and obsessed with the idea, because you could see there were little settlements, like cottages that were now like under the water and flooded. And it was the creepiest thing.
So in Appalachia, where I'm from, East Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley Authority, you know, we had a lot of flash floods back in the day, and they were controlled by a series of dams. And my father used to take a sailboat, and he would sail on those lakes when I was a kid. And you know, that was a formative memory. But underneath, particularly Watauga Lake in East Tennessee, kind of real close to the North Carolina border in Cherokee National Forest, under that had been a town. And it was incredibly unsettling. Like there were several times I would be there at night. There was an island that you could go out to on a boat and just think about like what was under there, what was buried, you know, what people's lives and memories and graves, etc., were down underneath there, with old rotting trees sticking up out of the mud, you know. So ripe for horror, right? You know, endlessly limitless potential of being pretty spooked by what was down in there. And then potentially getting trapped, which was a true hazard if you were a boater, to be trapped in some treetops. And, you know, when the water levels would be too low, you know, you couldn't really navigate very well. And even if you did. So that was always, I always thought about that as like not very fun to think about, really. You know, like what else is under there?
We used to go and camp on an island in the middle, like we were swallows and Amazons, and my dad would canoe out with us and then drop us off with the older children, and we would just be left there for a night. And I always felt like what was going to grab me from beneath. And actually, the closest I've ever come to dying is in that loch. I almost drowned in that loch, and I still remember like the coldness of it and the feeling of just being like pulled down. So, yeah. I've like freaked myself out now.
Pleasant dreams.
Pleasant dreams, yeah. Endless libraries. It could be work.
We already have endless entertainment.
Yeah, true. Okay, so let's go back to there's a question from Martine. How did we cover that? How do you decide what not to explain? How do you preserve mystery without frustrating the audience?
Oh, that's a fine line to walk, right? Because like I said earlier, I don't want to over-explain things, but you also at some point need to give the audience a bone, so to speak. Pardon the strap that keeps falling. It's a bow tied. As long as it doesn't come untied, we're good. But so I like to dole things out most of the time as a slow build and peeling back layers of mystery as you're kind of wading through the story. Now with Godfestation, it's basically a cold open. She's like thrown into this monster on the mountaintop, and she has to flee, right? So that's out of the gate, which is unusual for me to do that and say something is super wrong here, you know, like and it's just immediate. But most of the time I like to build it slowly, and crafting that takes care, because you don't want to insult the intelligence of your audience, who is probably trying to guess what it is. And in fact, when I was writing my space opera books, in terms of the horror element, what is this creature that's on this space station invading these people's lives? You know, like it was a long slow drip to reveal what it was, because it also hid another character from who was something, he was something else, and so that's two mysteries that I had to kind of tiptoe around in Heliopause specifically. I feel like decide to explain that something is happening if you want that to be real in the story. If you don't want it to be a hallucination of your character, you have to treat the character in that way, that this is a real thing that's happening. Like in Godfestation, it's really happening to her. She thinks it isn't, but then she notices other people are going through it. So that shared experience is a reality. And you know that kind of early on. In terms of preserving the mystery, I always just feel like, don't show everything that's in the shadows. Give the imagination time and opportunity to reach conclusions. And sometimes I don't solve everything, because sometimes it's scarier not to. And that kind of is a mirror about life. There's so much we don't know. And if we had an answer to everything, would we be afraid anymore? I don't know. We might be still, but on a different
We might be more afraid because we know everything that,
Right. And it's just a huge universe. And I think part of the fodder for Eldritch, particularly from the cosmic horror element, we just don't know what we don't know. We know a decent amount to have just been, out in the solar system for less than a century. And there's just so much we don't know. We don't even know much about our deep oceans, right? So, but there's a lot to be said for that being the ultimate mystery, right? What's out there? Who goes there?
I liked how you did it in Doomflower. I liked the build, what you saw at the start, and then like piecing together from her perspective what she was seeing and what she was experiencing, and like kind of that juxtaposition between her being a scientist and being pulled into like weird stuff that was happening, but fundamentally coming back to the science. I thought you did that really well in there.
Well, in Atacama, that's more along those lines, where they both have these horror elements.
Oh, I'm getting them mixed up, aren't I? It is Atacama. It's definitely Atacama was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, it's a different flavor, but kind of same area. And with Atacama, which came out they both came out in 2025. It's, if you like the X-Files and The Thing and the Twilight Zone, Atacama might be your jam. That one, I took my experience in research and I kind of translated as, a woman who's being gaslit at work in her relationship. Her best friend dies mysteriously in the Atacama Desert. She's in Appalachia while this happens. And then suddenly the monster is there with her and doling out what that is and where it came from. That is a slow burn as you're navigating this woman's grief and the collapse of her relationship and everything. And it's suddenly the monster's at the door, literally. So, and that's a very disorienting thing, and what she has to go through to deal with it. So there's definitely a cosmic horror element to Atacama that, there's just something out there that doesn't care what we think and about whether we're okay with them taking over. And then in you have like a campy plant horror Mean Girls situation, but there's an alien element there. You have something that there's a mystery of what happened to the main character's mother related to some science experiments. And there's something that makes plants run amok set in this sort of dark comedy background, but it's actually pretty sinister that the mother had researched something that was unexplained, and now it's wreaking havoc on the earth. So
I remember when we had Lynn Hardy on, who like writes and edits for Chaosium on kind of Call of Cthulhu and various other lines. I remember her talking about she expressed it far better than I will, but it was to do with like confronting us with like just how small we were in the scope of kind of everything, and like that underpinned like all of it. And again, what she was, and I suppose it must be the same for you as a writer, kind of writing for an audience, and she was talking about it more from the perspective as a games master at the table, trying to get your players just freaked out enough that they were enjoying the experience of being freaked out by their own kind of tininess in the scope, but not enough that they were having a full-blown existential crisis and running away from the table. So I suppose that's the other mystery you need to preserve is the ego of your reader so that they don't melt completely. But yeah,
this is my first game writing dungeon called Hanamal, which comes out next month. It's a choose your own adventure horror fantasy that's very Stranger Things kind of vibe, and that's game writing. That's my first game writing, and the kids in this are exploring this abandoned 80s mall, which was supposedly a toxic spill. It was a warlock from another dimension. So they're put through some actual horrors in here and have to deal with trying to find a friend. So like I feel like you're put in moments of disorientation and pretty spooky situations. You have to make decisions on the fly. And I love that. And it makes me want to write more game stuff. So I appreciate that skill. It's so great.
Okay. It's good. It's good that you've done one of the. They seem to be a little bit of a renaissance for these kind of adventure books just now.
Yeah.
Just last week, I had my little S1 class, so that's like 11, 12-year-old. I don't know what grade that'd be in America, but I had them up in the library, and there's like 3 of them were like just reading them. That's what they decided they wanted to read in the library.
Middle grade, so it's to be for like preteen. And the main characters are preteen. They're doing this for their vlog. They're going into this abandoned mall, like, oh, let's go record it, and then bad things happen, very bad things.
So Beerville, if we have time, I want to come back to Pluribus in case you've watched that, because I think that has a real cosmic element, and it sort of tricks you into thinking it's not. And yeah, anyway, we'll come back to that because I need to get through the questions from the comments. When you write Eldritch stories, do you have a rule set for how the Eldritch things function, or do you vibe it out, or both?
I mean, I know going in what their powers are going to be in our world, if that answers your question, because I am more of a plotter. In terms of how the characters react to that, I build that in as a moment of improvisation, because sometimes real life things will shape that character interaction, such as a death in the family, in which I have to kind of deal with that. And that you'll see that in several of the books for the past few years for me, is like that grief and stress, like that's affecting, I still have my plot, I still have my origins, but it's affecting the interactions I put my characters through, because I'm understanding that a lot of this is coming from coping with grief. And I really feel that that's a big piece of Eldritch horror, that it's not just, it's grief of person, it's grief of place, losing one's sense of who they are. It's about loss, and loss of identity or self or the world as we know it, which every day seems precipitously close to happening. So that's the best I can give you there. I do, like in the Veil of Seven Dragons, in this universe, this is an epic fantasy, and the villain is cosmic horror, and you just see it sort of creeping in.
I love the cover, by the way.
No, I know. Isn't it
I haven't read that one yet. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's first in a trilogy. I'm writing the sequel right now, and so like having that invade versus already being there, right? I feel like you kind of have to set that up. Is it a presence that was already there, or is it coming in, from another? And then you could make the argument either way that, oh, it could have already been there. If maybe it's just a familiar path coming in. So I do have a rule set for my approach, but I let the character interaction kind of play out a little bit different.
And then another one from Says, here's a question. Do you think simplicity can make a better Eldritch realm or being? Because for me, understanding of cosmic horror makes for a more interesting and horrifying experience.
Let me dig into this one. You think simplicity can make a better Eldritch realm of being? I mean, in some cases, like the Mountains of Madness, there was so much detail about the city and, about the beings in there. It was all the detail you ever want packed in a novella, right? So you had everything you could kind of dig into. But if we're flipping it over to say like John Carpenter's adaptation of Who Goes There, The Thing, I felt like that was way scarier, because, it took them a while to figure out what this thing was, that it had come from another planet, another world, think of another world, but the simplicity of it taking over a person, and in a small, tight, very claustrophobic place that you can't really get out of very easily, much less have people come in very easily. That to me was much scarier, but your mileage may vary. I feel like that's a unique experience for different people. And some people may actually, the more you know, the scarier it is, So and you can flip that on your work in different guises, So like the method, for example, of how it might intrude into our experience or how we are intruding on it, because I think it's always an element there that cosmic horror is uncaring of the human experience, views us as inferior, an accident, a joke, tiny, insignificant. We don't matter. They can do anything they want to us. It doesn't matter to them. And that's pretty freaking scary just on its own. So you can just run that however you want. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. You want to keep it simple, or you want to go into detail. That's your style and your preference. You're going to have an audience for it either way, I think.
And thank you so much, Ricky, for the super chat. This is really gross, actually. Just read through it. In A Vampire the Masquerade game, we bore witnesses to a realm of teeth, ew, for one, with miles of molars and a man of ash growing forth more teeth that are pushed out into the mountains of teeth. I hate that. I love it.
That's great.
It just, I don't even know where to begin. I think there is a special place in horror for like horror like that, which is the kind of thing you might dream and just wake up and be like what, where, how did my mind create that particularly bizarro stuff?
It's what the last Doctor Strange film should have been. The multiverse of madness. There was like one montage where he goes through all these mad worlds that are like totally different, and you're like, that should have been the whole film. It shouldn't have been a 5-second montage. But
like Everything Everywhere at Once. They end up in the place with the hot dog thing. And it's like horrific.
Plays with that stuff a lot.
So Mark asks, can you speak to the relationship between Eldritch horror and surreal horror? The King in Yellow has probably become the poster child for it, but how useful is surrealism for writing eldritchly generally?
I don't know. I mean, I do feel like Godfestation kind of straddles that line. I haven't really written a lot of surreal horror, but I think the closest it gets is Godfestation. And I mean, to me, Twin Peaks is kind of right there in between those two in a lot of ways. I think David Lynch had right. He was, even like not just in Twin Peaks, but also honestly, Mulholland Drive. I mean, was to me. I mean, that was obviously surreal horror, and to me, there was something sort of there. Okay, if you're in LA, like I am now, I grew up in Appalachia. Like there's something powerful here. That we don't. We're kind of guided by this powerful need to create and to be. And it can be a destructive force to deal with. And I wonder if in some ways that's LA's own eldritch horror at work. I'm just postulating for story purposes here. But, I think surrealism is very good for writing eldritch. Like when I do it in Godfestation, I'm derailing you kind of literally from the beginning, from what is everyday to what is strange and not quite right, has a glimmer out of the corner of your eye, or is overtly bizarre, which that book definitely, in its small package, I hope I accomplished that. I think it's useful because it's unsettling, disturbing, it's.
I find something eldritch about London, and specifically the city of London, the financial district, so round like the Gherkin and like Bishopsgate and stuff, where there's all the office buildings, because at night it's really weird because no one really lives there. And I didn't grow up in a really big city, like even Edinburgh, there's not places where people just leave at night, but there are streets in London where there's just shops that are open in the day, like high street shops, not like corner shops or like takeaways that would be open at night. And then there's just offices. And at a point in the evening, as you're walking through, you just suddenly feel like there's nobody here now. Like this place isn't for people.
Right. It's a liminal space.
Yeah, it's a liminal space. Money flows through it, but the people like come and go. And then you turn a corner and you're on this street that like Bishopsgate, that's just money street. And then you go around the corner and you're suddenly in a London that's like really vibrant and alive. And there's, shops that have been there, for generations who are, I don't know, like laundries or tailors, or like there's a gold shop, like things you also don't really see as much outside London, the kind of shops. And I just find it a really unsettling experience.
Yeah.
Especially on the borderline between it, where I'm like, there's people that actually live here, like, and they live in this weird place. So yeah, I find London eldritch.
Yeah,
or maybe just money.
I can see that. And other big cities, I've lived in Seattle, I've lived in San Francisco, and lived in LA, and I feel like, there's something transformative, not in a good way, in those areas where culture is discouraged, that the goal is greed. And there's something very damaging and creepy about that. Like, and it definitely puts a flavor in those kind of spaces, these financial districts. Something's not quite healthy and right about it. Like, you go there specifically for one thing and you leave, but I feel like it can follow you home too.
Yeah, and London has been inhabited. There is a certain vibe in some places, and some of the weirdest bits of London are the financial districts, because, like I said, because of the emptiness. But then you turn a corner, and in between two massive skyscrapers, there's a little street, and there's the oldest church in London, and it's been there, and people have been worshipping there since 956.
Yeah.
And it's just there, just like sitting there. I find it a really creepy place to walk around.
London comes across to me as an Escher print.
Yeah.
There's just this strange juxtaposition that doesn't quite flow right.
Yeah, it's like the old and the new next to each other. Last time I was down there, there was, round the corner from Gresham Street, there's the like worshipful company of, not copper, it wasn't pewter. I think it was pewter beaters or something. And all of their window boxes, unlike normal window boxes, were clearly made with pewter, just like because they were the pewter beaters, and it was just weird. It just has such a weird vibe.
I love that.
Very strange city.
That's very, very interesting.
Yeah, and there's loads of places like that are like the old juxtaposed against the new.
Yeah, like in the Americas, like the Rust Belt in Appalachia, coal country. Sort of transition from one era to another in a lingering, industry or its decay, that definitely flavors a lot of stories here.
And Martine asks, Eldritch settings often use scale and incomprehensibility, which we have talked about a lot on the stream, but how do you keep these emotionally grounded so readers still care? Do you always write with a human protagonist that centers the story? Would you ever write, or have you written stories that don't have like that grounding from a mortal's perspective?
I mean, I have written of Alien Immortals, the Questers saga, for sure, with Ariad and Galadea, who are trying to, coexist with several alien species and as well as androids and monsters. So, I've definitely written from those perspectives of non-human people or beings, whatever you want to call them. And I think that when you have that kind of environment, when you're writing from a multi-species point of view, that does enrich the experience, because you see it's not just affecting people, this is something galactic and beyond what they can deal with by themselves, which is why you have this ragtag team coming together, or different planets are trying to fight against this horrible enemy, so I like the big scale, but you have to keep it, to the characters. It's really fun to talk about otherworldly things that are incomprehensible and bizarre and ancient and old, but how's it affecting you as a reader? How's it affecting the characters? So you're investing your time in. I hope I thread the needle decently well with that. I tend to be known more for my characters, having their various quirks and being, some of them extremely flawed, other ones, really good. Like I like the range.
And Another question from Martine. What's the difference between a setting that feels mysterious and one that just feels underwritten? How do you ration out the detail you give your reader? Yeah. Oh, okay. Good. Yeah. The difference is a good editor. That is a good answer, Jendia.
I mean, we got to have our editors, but in terms of like, if you're the writer, I think it just takes practice. Like, you've got to keep trying it, read mysteries and try to unpack how they work and why. Expose yourself to more, steep yourself in that. And, it's a cheap cop-out to just suddenly, disappear and not ever say anything about what's happening. While I don't like to reveal too much behind the curtain all the time, you still have to give the audience something, in my opinion, unless you're being deliberate and from the beginning, that this is never going to be solved, but to me, if I want to know something, even if I never learn everything, and knowing a little bit of something is actually kind of scarier. So, but in terms of being underwritten, yeah, that's editorial stuff.
It's something whenever I'm teaching kids to write stories, like I always talk to them about resolution, and I'm like, you need resolution at the end of your story. That's not necessarily explaining everything, but it might be the resolution is more character based in terms of character growth and stuff, or it might be that it's more like it depends on the story, but you owe the reader some sense of resolution at the end. And if you nail that, you can get away with hiding the things you don't want to talk about because they feel satisfied at the end of the story. But
or you can be cool like me and have a couple of cliffhangers, which made people insane.
Yeah, but that's intentional, which is all good. Yeah.
Yeah. But not always resolving it, or perhaps ever resolving it, as I often did as a young person. Yeah. And I woke up and it was all a dream.
No, that is expressly forbidden in my department. Kids are not allowed to. Yeah.
I watched Dallas. I watched Dallas as a young kid. I learned that lesson early.
Yeah, I do. It's the first thing I tell them when they write a story. I'm like, you're not allowed to ever end a story like that. They're like, oh.
No. Good. I'm glad you do, because I did it. I must, when you're at primary school. But I think actually what would be quite good to get children out of that habit is to set that as a task. I want you to write a story where you do wake up and it's all a dream, but make it interesting.
Yeah, make it that a good ending, not a cop out.
Yeah, make that a good ending. Make that an ending where not a cop out. So thoughts on settings like Elden Ring that blend more recognizable fantasy with more Eldritch vibes.
Here we are. I kind of wrote something like that, a little bit more lighthearted, but still goes kind of hardcore in parts. My younger teenager plays Elden Ring, so I've seen that world and the immersion in it. Love it. I love it. I don't think more is more to me in all of this. Yeah. More is more fantasy, more cosmic horror, more horror, more. We need more. It's so, especially right now, there's a move away from classic sci-fi, except for a couple blockbusters, because we're living a sci-fi moment, right? We're living all the stuff that we wrote about decades ago, the AI and all the changes. But fantasy and horror, I love blending the two whenever I can.
Yeah.
And
I enjoyed Elden Ring, but I would say that I found it ended up being not as immersive as it could be, because I was drawn. There wasn't a clear enough a story that engaged me and hooked me and actually showed me where to go next. And because of the mechanics of it, it ended up being reduced to a mathematical equation. I would die, and then I would come back in, and I would go to the place that I knew these creatures were, that I could get the things that I needed from them, because they were I'd found a way to kill them, but they were high. They gave you a lot of, I can't remember what you collect. Is it souls? Whatever it is that you collect. And then, and you would predict the patterns of them. And it ended up becoming less story driven for me. Yeah. And I think it really lacked it didn't ever feel spooky because because of
Yeah, it was more atmospheric to me. I didn't.
It was atmospheric. Yeah, I like the vibe and I like the aesthetics and to begin with, it was actually really terrifying, and the repeating things and going through a camp and working out what creature would be where was quite scary, but it did end up being reduced to a bit of a mathematical equation in the end.
Yeah, And I similarly, I bounced off of it a bit for very similar reasons, Lindsay, that there wasn't a clear enough narrative for me.
Yeah, right. I got to the first boss and I was like, I don't know. No, in fact, I didn't even get to the first boss because I didn't realize there was one. And Andy Law was like, you have to go here. And I was like, well, I didn't know
why?
that.
Yeah.
Why?
Like it was similar to when, you know, sometimes you, like, and sometimes it worked, like with shows like Succession, say, you can watch that and you hate every single character, but you still want to watch the show. But often when you get a show and you don't care about the characters, those are the shows that don't work, because you're like, what? If I don't care about them, why do I care about what they're doing? And that was kind of what I felt with Elden Ring. I was like, I don't care about any of this. I'm in no way invested. Like, I literally, it was one of the last games I bought on physical media, and I bought it, and I actually took it back and got a refund like 2 days later and just traded it out for another game. I'm like, it's not for me. And I know lots of people who love it, and my mate keeps telling me I'm wrong and I should play it again, but it's just not for me.
Yeah. I have thought about going back to it, but you mentioned, I said we might come back to Pluribus, and I do just want to talk about it because I think at first glance it's not particularly eldritch or sinister, and you kind of get presented by a person who you start to feel like, because of her behaviors, you maybe don't like her and she's not the hero. And then you realize you've kind of been tricked into accepting something truly and utterly awful, and that when people protest against things, they're not always do it in a likable way, because they can't do it in a likable way to get their point across. And I actually found that utterly terrifying.
Yeah, it's obviously Pluribus is addressing technological stuff we're dealing with right now, like AI, you know, and social upheaval. It's got a lot of commentary, a lot of things, identity, who we are, you know, some of the classic things juxtaposed against the modern. I really like that, you know, you think you've got a zombie show, but it's really not that. You think you've got an alien invasion show, but it's not just that. You think you've got a woman on the brink going through it. Yeah, it's definitely that. But, you know, she doesn't need to be this superhero in order to, you know what I mean? She doesn't need to be likable. I like her because I see
I do like her.
Survivor. She's a survivor in every sense of the word. So because we learn about her past, which was very unpleasant, you know, that she was put in this horrible situation in her youth, and she's crusty. She's been a successful writer, you know, but she's brittle. She's basically going through it, and she meets up and communicates with somebody who is flawed in his own way. We don't know everything about that guy. You know, where I like how it turned everything on its head and made it so like it's like an old fable. Like you get everything you ever wanted, everything you could ever possibly want or crave, or taste or wear or drive or anything. But the flip side is that you're no longer you. And the minute that
it's a real monkey's paw.
Like what happened to the girl, you know, like the minute they put on this picture
in the village,
made it seem like this was a spiritual thing. This was a family thing. And the very second it flips, they drop everything and they leave. It doesn't matter. It's all a sham. And that's terrifying. The erasure of culture is terrifying.
I totally agree. So I was annoyed that it tricked me initially into feeling like you just do. When someone's so rude and unpleasant, you feel a natural reaction towards them. And I had to bring myself back I felt like they tricked me. And then I did like Carol. And like once you put yourself in her shoes, you're like, no, I would be exactly like that. If my husband had been taken away from me, if my children had been taken from me.
They killed her wife.
They killed her wife.
Like
it's the reverse Breaking Bad, right? Like Breaking Bad is all about you sympathize with Walter, but then you realize what a monster he is. Well, and it's the reverse. You don't sympathize with her, but then as it goes on, you're like, no, actually, no, I really, really do. I think Vince Gilligan is fucking incredible.
He is, and the way he peels back a mystery is kind of drives us crazy because we guess all these things, right? And then he's a master at mystery. You know, in this case, like. In Breaking Bad, it's in the title. This guy's going to break bad. He's going to break bad, right? So, like, you follow that along, you know, and that is a mystery that unfolds over time, becomes obvious, but it's more nuanced. And so I think that he knows how to thread that needle. So, and in terms of Carol, like, this is literally a signal, an extraterrestrial signal. We, for whatever reason, translated and started making, for their own code, following their instructions. And then the ultimate goal is to keep sharing that signal. We don't know where it came from. Like, even though that one signal came from this one place, that's not the origin, probably.
Yeah.
It's scarier. So something out there is erasing galactic culture or universe culture. We don't know what that is, which is very scary, or
I think
or could it just be like a freaking accident? Like it was an act. We don't know.
Yeah.
So that's part of them.
A disease.
Yeah.
Like it's just an illness, actually. But potentially, but I think you've hit on it. I do think that one of the most horrific parts is the village when the culture is stripped away.
Yeah.
When
terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely terrifying. I agree.
And at that point, if you're not rocking with, getting the I'm not going to spoil it, but getting the item at the end of the season, well, I don't know what to tell you, but like I know where she's coming from with that. I'd be like, yeah, you know what? If we need a back door out of here because they've already they tricked her and took her parts of her to make something that would transfer her into them. It's just disgusting.
Yeah, it does have a lot to say on bodily autonomy and
it does.
And just culture.
She's being
overwhelmed by
constantly.
On a like planetary
global
level. Yeah.
And then also within the other survivors who are in such crazy denial, except for our certain South American friend.
Or the one in Vegas. Is he in Vegas, the French one? I don't think he's in denial. I think he's just he's just happy with it. He's accepted.
Yeah.
Which is he's the worst. He's the absolute worst.
Exactly. Which is the
fact that he's okay with everybody using their bodily autonomy for his own gain is
it's horrific.
It's nasty.
And again, it does the thing of when you first see it, it makes it look glamorous, it makes it look attractive,
right?
And then the scene where he's almost like role playing a James Bond, and then as soon as he leaves, you see them switch off, and it again, much like the village, that little vignette just turns on a dime, and you're like,
yeah.
What's one thing that was interesting about him though was the scene where Carol's with him, and he makes breakfast, and she takes it, and she makes this sandwich, and he's like, I hadn't really, to sum it up, he was like, I never really thought about doing anything that way, which underlined the whole premise is like the individuality of each of us, no matter how flawed, is preferable to, this something invading us, taking us over, who doesn't care about us. It is cosmic horror in that regard.
Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of our hour, so thank you so much, Jendia, for joining us as always. Always a pleasure. And if viewers could do one thing for you, what would you have them do? Where would they go to find out all the information and buy all your books?
My website is a great place to start, jendiagammon.com, JendiaGammon. And everything is linked from there. I have a books page. I have a blog. I am pretty active on Threads and Instagram, Blue Sky some. But various and sundry places. I have a lot of conventions I'll be at this year. I'll be at WonderCon. I will be very probably at San Diego Comic-Con. I'll be at LA Times Festival of Books. I will be at Midsummer Scream. I'll be at the Hugo Awards at WorldCon, which is going to be in LA this year. And I'll be at World Fantasy, which is actually coming to California in the Bay Area. So I'm going to be there. I'm going to be in the horror, sci-fi, fantasy space. And I'll be on tour for Dungeon Crawl at the Haunted Mall. Awesome. And that's going to be a hoot because some of that will be interactive, going through the choices and the choose your own adventure. And so find me out there, connect. I love talking about sci-fi, fantasy, and horror anytime.
Well, we'll check all that out. I hope Andy, I think, has probably put all those links in the chat to the website. And goodbye to your adorable mug, and goodbye to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you as always to our patrons and all the excellent people in the chat. Until next time, good night and caw-caw, caw-caw. See you soon.